Welcome back to your Essentials group on the Gospel of John. This week we take a look at another one of Jesus' famous I am statements. You'll remember these are unique to John and they are incredibly multifaceted. That is, they have all of these different angles and points of significance to the degree that you don't just read them once and simply get the point. Jesus wants us, even still today, to ponder these statements, perhaps memorize them and see what they might mean for us in new ways and in our own particular lives.
In our reading today, Jesus claims that he is the light of the world. You'll remember, this is a topic that we've already visited back in the prologue in chapter 1. It refers to Jesus as the light. And it's helpful here to simply reflect on how important light is. We've all had the experience of the power going out in the night and being unable to see. It's disorienting, dangerous even, until you find a flashlight or a candle. It's absolutely debilitating to be in complete darkness. And of course, in Jesus' world, with no electricity, no city lighting of any kind, and nothing more powerful than torches and candles, it was a dark world. And so, when Jesus claims to be the light of the world, one of the things he is simply saying is that by him, we can see everything else. When we turn to him, all of the external world becomes more discernible and comprehensible.
That's exactly right. Jesus actually makes sense of our lives and the rest of the world that we live in. And so when we imagine this metaphor, we likely gravitate toward thinking of Jesus like the light of the sun, illuminating the entirety of the world. But again, there's more here. Remember back in chapter 1, John speaks as if we live in great darkness. And so while Jesus most certainly is like the light of the sun, he can also be like a steady candle that gives out light in especially dark and confining places that can be fearful or overwhelming. And so in this way, Jesus means also that he is a source of trust and hope. He casts out fear in places of dread or despair. And so you see what we mean. These I am statements can and do mean a whole host of things. Light for illumination, a light of hope, and so much more.
Even in your own life, you'll notice these I am statements encourage you in different ways if you meditate on them long enough. However, there is also a clear and singular theme that emerges in this passage and continues throughout the rest of the gospel, which is the resistance of the Pharisees. You'll notice in our passage, the Pharisees show up once again, and here they're vocally adversarial to Jesus. However, back in chapter 7, it even says that they plotted to kill Jesus. They were entirely committed to work against him. It's important to remember here, the Pharisees were not just neutral onlookers to Jesus' teaching, but they grew to be actively antagonistic to him. And they did this because Jesus challenged everything about their way of life as a religious expert. When Jesus showed up and people began to marvel at his teaching and his power, suddenly these religious experts were no longer the experts. And so they publicly challenged his authority to fight for their position of relevance and control. Again, you'll see how this becomes a major theme in the rest of the gospel.
And what this condition means for our passage today is, I think, twofold. First, it means that the I am statement about Jesus being the light of the world makes sense. Now we see some of the darkness that this light cuts into, the darkness that was mentioned back in the prologue, this human desire for power and control that can ultimately become completely blinding, like darkness. You see, where the previous I am statement was about Jesus being the bread of life, satisfying a condition of need, today we see how Jesus confronts a condition of misunderstanding and control and even conflict. And then the second thing that this condition reveals is the way the authority of Jesus' testimony becomes absolutely crucial. In this condition of conflict and darkness, discerning what is really true, of course, becomes absolutely critical. You need to know what's trustworthy and what isn't. And so in the second half of our reading today, the primary topic is about discerning what authority grounds Jesus' teaching about himself.
This is, of course, a really important theme for understanding the rest of John. We need to see that while the Pharisees in these passages are wrong, they're not dumb. It's tempting to think that they're simply misguided and stubborn, but there's far more going on here, because they realize rightly that someone who says the kinds of things that Jesus says needs to do so under a very real and discernible authority. Think about, in the Old Testament, when God showed up, you didn't doubt it. His presence was otherworldly and dangerous. He was veiled in fire and smoke. But when this man, just a human being, shows up and claims to be God's own son, like we see in chapter 5, there is no pillar of fire or consuming presence. So the Pharisees justifiably ask, by whose authority are you claiming these things? And when Jesus responds and says, by my Father, they also justifiably ask, well then where is he? And Jesus says bluntly, you don't know him.
This is an incredible moment in the Gospel of John, and it reveals to us the heart of the conflict that emerges in Jesus' coming. See, in this whole discussion of authority and true testimony, it's not just about who is right and who's wrong. It is, will Jesus prove these claims about himself? How might he prove these claims? What authority will be on display as he teaches and instructs about himself and about God? These are questions, I'll remind you, that we still ask in our everyday lives. Will Jesus be who he says he is? How could he possibly know what my experience is like? See, we still ask, how do we know what Jesus says and promises is true? And of course, he has an answer. But don't also miss how wrapped up in all of this is, how can the holy, all-consuming God of Israel somehow show up and speak to us face to face? In other words, even though Jesus' authority is the issue here, Jesus will again prove to us who he is throughout the gospel. Don't miss the Pharisees' understandable question that they ask for true verification of his authority. They ask this because the issue at stake is, how could God show up in a form that is so fragile and so finite and even gentle? And thus, what would that mean about God and about us?
So the light of the world has come with authority, which brings us understanding and hope. Don't miss the manner Jesus enters into a world in such an unexpected way. We hope that as you discuss how Jesus bears the true testimony of God, you would come to see him in new ways, and that you would have faith as he instructs us.